Hello there, I'm Jon Garland from the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey. The title of my paper today is Together They Weren't Stronger, Charting the Rise and Fall of the Democratic Football Lads Alliance. And what I thought I'd do in the next 20 minutes or so is try and work out, well, what is the nature of this rather strangely named organisation, the Democratic Football Lads Alliance? How did it start? What are its politics? And then what's caused it to apparently have something of a downfall, in the last sort of half year or so after initially being very successful. So, the DFLA, for short, the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, was formed in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 2017 in England, and I'm thinking perhaps especially of the London Bridge attack, the Westminster Bridge one too, and especially the one that occurred at the Manchester Arena, which seemed to absolutely galvanise certain sections of football supporter networks into action. And what happened was, initially formed as the Football Lads Alliance, a large-scale street-based protest movement appeared, seemingly in reaction to those terrorist incidents. It's made up of a loose alliance of those that were involved in mainly sort of football hooligan networks, or had been involved in the past, or were in receipt of banning orders, which meant that they couldn't do it, drawing on perhaps a similar constituency to an organisation which is seen as far right, which is the English Defence League, and that's where the English Defence League got a lot of its support when it first started in 2009. So the aim of the DFLA, or simply called the Football Lads Alliance at the time, was simply to be opposed or against all extremism, and that was it. So quite a vague, initial statement of intent, if you like. Simple aim of being opposed to all extremism. And going under the banner of Together We Are Stronger, which was often, shortened to TWAS in hashtags, the Football Lads Alliance, as it was then, seemingly started very strongly, and seemingly was capable of drawing on organised, football groups, and to get them to march together, putting all rivalries aside, in the name of countering extremism in all its forms. And this is Chris Allen trying to, to decipher that and how it managed to draw on football supporters so successfully. In the past, then, said Allen, political ideology was used to construct a shared and unifying identity. For the DFLA, the opposite was true. Football was the means for constructing a similarly shared identity from which any political ideology followed. So it drew on football, and then, resultantly for the DFLA, football was always a means to an end, and a means to communicate both to and through the football family the established grievances of the counter-jihad movement. In particular, that Islam and Muslims posed a threat to us. So in the views of Allen, of course, almost right from the start, the DFLA had something of an Islamophobic element to it. They denied, right from the very start, that they were Islamophobic or that they were racist, and the first leader of the Football Lads Alliance, John Megan, told The Times in March 2018, "People want to label us as far right. All we are," he said, "is working class people, and all we want is a safer place for our children and grandchildren." But the Football Lads Alliance split in 2018 and became the Democratic Football Lads Alliance. But nevertheless, still seemed to be very potent, and certainly early on, it managed to attract some, extraordinary numbers for an allegedly far-right group to its demonstrations against all extremism. And so, for example, in June of 2017, it attracted 10,000 to one of its early demonstrations, which in fact is, is a massive turnout, and certainly way bigger than the English Defence League ever managed, that the British National Party ever managed, or the National Front, or other similarly street-focused far-right groups. And then following that, in October of 2017, the Football Lads Alliance managed to attract at least 30,000 to one of its demonstrations. Again, seemingly marching under the banner of being, Together We Are Stronger and against all extremism, things like that. And very vocally, its leadership would deny that it was Islamophobic, that it was far-right, that it was racist. Yet some of the speakers on its marches and on its demonstrations seemingly had links to the far-right. So, for example, Anne-Marie Walters spoke at one of them, the leader of For Britain, a far-right organisation. So Anne-Marie Walters was present and spoke at the DFLA's marches and demonstrations. At a DFLA march in March 2018, Tommy Robinson was seen, and indeed he was greeted like something of a lost hero by the DFLA's core membership when he joined the demonstration. And so if somebody who's the acknowledged sort of poster boy of the far right internationally was greeted as a hero on the DFLA's marches, it may give an indication of what was actually evident amongst its grassroots core support. So, well, what on earth does the DFLA actually stand for, though? It can be all too easy at times to just say, yes, it's a racist organisation, yes, it's of the far right, it's extremist. And so what I tried to do last year, just a bit of basic preliminary research, was to have a look at the DFLA's Twitter feed and its Facebook posts as well, just trying to see, well, what can I garner regarding its political views and the sort of issues that it was concerned about. So I looked at its Twitter feed and its Facebook feed from the 1st of March 2019 to the 15th of June 2019. It posted 92 times via its Twitter feed and then 364 times on its Facebook feed, so much more active on Facebook than it was on Twitter. And some of the key issues really that it seemed to be very concerned about was Brexit. So for example, 14% of its posts, around about 50 on Facebook in that time period, were very much pro-Brexit. And that's one of the key issues that it was worried about. Of course, it doesn't necessarily make it far right, of course. It was very anti-establishment, so very concerned about the activities of Parliament. And at the time, before Brexit was seemingly sort of signed and sealed, it seemed very aggressive and very worked up about the fact that it thought Parliament was trying to obstruct Brexit. It was very anti-left, so vocally anti a number of left-wing people, but worryingly especially seemed to focus on prominent MPs that were from visible minority ethnic backgrounds, or the leader of, or the mayor of the City of London, Sadiq Khan as well. Diane Abbott was also targeted, David Lammy was, in a way that it seemed like sort of, white left-wing politicians, apart from perhaps Jeremy Corbyn, weren't. So they seemed to very much focus on those three visible minority ethnic politicians. One of the key themes of its posts and its tweets was the fact that it was very pro-military veterans, so fiercely pro-military veterans. And that's one of its key issues, and indeed the one that came out the strongest. So 15% of its tweets in that time period were about military veterans. A quarter, or 94 of its Facebook posts, were also on a similar theme. So very, very concerned about the plight of military veterans. And of course its leadership was vocally anti-racist via its Twitter feed and its Facebook posts. But it seems like many of the replies, for example, to the leadership's tweets or Facebook posts seem to uncover, an undercurrent of racism, of xenophobia, and of Islamophobia, the sort of things that were also witnessed on its marches too, from the grassroots. Just like the English Defence League before them, when its former leader Tommy Robinson would, actively say that the EDL was not racist, was not of the extreme right, and yet you'd see its members behaving exactly as though they were. And similarly, on occasion, that was witnessed from the followers of the DFLA too. A lot of its other posts were concerned about things like immigration. They were laced with patriotism and nationalism. Again, it doesn't necessarily make them of the far right, of the extreme right. And indeed, one of the quirks, really, of the DFLA was the fact that it has campaigned actively around a number of issues that you wouldn't perhaps necessarily associate with the far right. So, for example, it was involved in campaigning for the homeless and helping the homeless out in Birmingham and other places. It staged a number of marches and demonstrations against child abuse. It's joined the Justice for the 21 campaign. And what that's all about is the fact that in the Birmingham pub bombings of November 1974, which killed 21 people, no one has ever been properly, anyway, convicted for them. Of course, there was the case that the Birmingham Six were convicted initially and originally for the Birmingham pub bombings, but it, of course, emerged after a number of years of campaigning that that was a massive miscarriage of justice, and they were quite rightly released with their sentences quashed. And so, in other words, those that actually undertook the Birmingham pub bombings are still out there. And so the DFLA is very much involved in the Justice for the 21 campaign. And as I mentioned, very concerned about the plight of military veterans, and perhaps the issue above all that exercised it during the time period I was looking at his tweets, and indeed since, has been the prosecution of the person known as Soldier F for murdering, allegedly, 2 people on what became known as Bloody Sunday on the 30th of January 1972. When the British Army opened fire upon peaceful demonstrators in Northern Ireland. So that's become an issue that has inflamed the DFLA. The thought that a military veteran could be prosecuted for murder was for them an utter outrage. And as I mentioned, they were also, campaigning, against the sort of political establishment, particularly when it looked as though Parliament, in their eyes, was trying to block Brexit, calling them the self-serving pigs in the house of treason, and then more threatening below, using imagery that seemed to indicate that there would be violent disorder on the streets of Britain if Brexit was cancelled. So something a little bit more menacing there at the bottom. But, having managed to garner the support of thousands on its demonstration, sometimes tens of thousands on its demonstration, what caused the campaigning group Hope Not Hate in 2020 to say that the recent times have seen a demise of the DFLA? And in fact, at the moment, they don't seem to have an active, proper website. The Twitter account appears to be dormant. So what has happened to the DFLA in just the blink of an eye? That seems as though it's somehow lost its way. Well, June the 13th of this year may be one of the key reasons as to why that happened. And what happened was the DFLA managed to mobilise thousands of its supporters up and down the country, concentrated in London, but not solely there by any means, to basically protest against the defacing of war memorials and allegedly protect them because the DFLA and its supporters had been outraged that a statue in London of Winston Churchill had been daubed with the words "is a racist" during and after a Black Lives Matter recent protest. And indeed, a statue of Edward Colston, the slave trader, was thrown into the river by protesters in Bristol recently as well. And those two things, but especially the attack upon Winston Churchill's statue, seemed to inflame the DFLA. It came out in force to supposedly protect them for any further vandalism and defacing on June the 13th. But the protests descended into violent disorder. There was racist chanting witnessed and heard at some of the events up and down the country, including the ones in London, where DFLA supporters were witnessed giving Nazi salutes and things like that. And then to also inflame public opinion further against the DFLA, one of its supporters was seen urinating next to a memorial to the fallen police officer Keith Palmer, who was killed during the Westminster terror attacks of 2017. And that was seen as being monumentally disrespectful. And the DFLA became vilified, not just from the media, but from other politically active groups on the right too. And it was just seen to be an organisation that couldn't control its far-right, extremist, racist, violent members. So it seemed to go on the retreat in the immediate aftermath of June the 13th and the violent disorders that it seemingly appeared to organise. So this is its leadership talking on Facebook on June the 13th about the events that happened. I'm truly devastated about today. The instigators got their way, as they did last week at the Black Lives Matter protest. Indeed, all the typos here are from the original posts. Also on June the 13th, the leadership saying, being very angry and aiming this at those that had engaged in racism or violent disorder or fighting with the police. Thank you for ruining it for everyone. Thank you for making all the MSM, the mainstream media, and the far left right, or appear right. Thank you for compromising our veterans for the sake of your bloody egos. And this may upset some of you, but if you attack the police today, if you chanted racist abuse, then you're not what the DFLA are about. If today has left you with a feeling of doom and sadness, stay strong. Stick to your values. We are not a violent racist organisation, seemingly in spite of the evidence. And then on the day after, again, the leadership posting on Facebook, we'd like to make it clear that this behaviour, and that's talking about one of its supporters seemingly urinating next to the memorial to the fallen police officer, this behaviour is disgraceful and disrespectful. If it is real and you recognise the person committing this act of disrespect and proving it was real later on for the fallen officer, then you need to have a serious word and get him to apologise. So the DFLA seemed to be on retreat and in disarray following the violent racist disorder seemingly at events that it organised in June of 2020. Another factor might be that's seen its supposed downfall is that the far right and the alt-right and other aspects of it recently have grabbed the headlines and grabbed the zeitgeist, perhaps for those that are minded to support such organisations. So there's a brief flourishing recently, of course, of the Yellow Vest movement that we've seen in a number of European countries. And then there have been other organisations that have sprung up recently on the far right that seem to be making some headway and perhaps gaining some of the support that the DFLA once had. People like Patriotic Alternative or Hearts of Oak, which is some sort of organisation that various members of the extreme right are involved in, including Tommy Robinson. Then there's a sort of extreme right environmentalist group calling themselves British Revival. And then this group, you can see there, like Save Our Rights UK, Stand Up X, Eyes Wide Open, that are part of the recent sort of anti-lockdown, anti-vaccination demonstrations that have been occurring in England as well. And whether they've grabbed some of the zeitgeist away from the DFLA. And then, of course, the rise of the QAnon conspiracy theory, which is a very curious phenomenon, of course, that started in the United States and seems to be getting some sort of a foothold here too. And QAnon supporters were seen on the the recent anti-lockdown protests, and as well perhaps have just stolen some of the DFLA's thunder. But other key contributory factors in the downfall of the DFLA seems to have been, the internal splits. I mentioned fairly early on in its life, it split, and the original leader, John Meehan, was ousted and replaced by a leader, Philip Hickin, that perhaps wasn't as effective. And of course, one of the problems with an organisation like the DFLA, when its seemingly sole aim is to counter all extremism, well, what does that mean? And how do you know whether you've achieved that or not? So lack of clear objectives, of clear aims and goals means that it doesn't really perhaps have a purpose. And then, the requirement, if you are a street-based organisation, that your members keep going out and marching and demonstrating can become dispiriting. It requires an awful lot of energy, particularly if it seems like nothing has been achieved. And then it also seems like, following the fallout of the march of 13th of June, that, those demonstrations may attract people that are racist and violent. There were tensions apparently as well between the various football firms, or at least some of them, that were involved in the sort of the grassroots of the DFLA. So they were falling out with each other as well. So perhaps together they weren't stronger after all. And then, of course, as we've seen, the lack of ability of the leadership to A, monitor who on earth attends its demonstrations, and then B, to control their violent racist behaviour. But of course, it's only a blink of an eye ago really that those groups were out there and they were actively campaigning and getting 30,000 on a march. And so my guess is that they're still out there. They may be dormant at the moment, there may be other issues that they're focusing on or other causes, but perhaps it would only take one spark, perhaps another terrorist outrage, for them to become active again. And seeing how the EDL also managed to mobilise significant numbers of people when it first started out, and the DFLA did too, my guess is that they've not gone away, and that it'll only take something like a terrorist incident to spark them back into life again. Okay, I'll end it there. Hopefully you found that useful. Thank you.